Hello, it's Lisa Waldman here. I am a psychotherapist and a public health educator here in Los Angeles. And today I am going to talk about how lupus patients or anyone who may be high risk can manage this phase of, oops, I've got to get the camera here. One second. Let's switch this back. There we go. Can manage this phase of society reopening, both from a practical physical standpoint and from an emotional health standpoint. And I know there are a lot of feelings coming up as healthy individuals are beginning to reintegrate into society, going back into certain social and work environments. But if you're high risk and you are still planning to stay inside and need to be more careful, it may be a difficult transitional time. So while it may feel like everyone can leave the house, I do want to point out that that's not true. And just to be clear, 45% of Americans have some kind of chronic illness and 20% of Americans are over 65. And there are also plenty of young people having severe reactions to COVID, or young people who want to protect their parents and therefore don't want to venture out. So while places may be opening up, they're not necessarily filling up, and many people are holding back and using their best judgment based on science, rather than based on the policies of what's allowed. So if you're on the younger side and you do have hardy friends who are less concerned or have a higher risk tolerance, or maybe they're more casual about COVID-19 in general, and they're just not protecting themselves as much, it may leave you in an uncomfortable place emotionally, feeling different. Today I want to divide my talk into two parts. The first one being, what are the risks in the various environments, so that you can think about your specific situation in terms of socializing, shopping, activities, and work, and really make decisions that are appropriate for you. Some of this might be repetitive for you. Maybe you've been following the science very closely about the different environments, but I'm going to spend about 10 minutes running through that just to make sure that you're sort of well informed and kind of armed with the information that you need to make healthy choices and really, appropriate decisions for you. And then I'm going to talk specifically about coping with being high risk during the pandemic, essentially looking at adapting, dealing with emotions, setting boundaries with people, advocating for yourself in the workplace, and most importantly, really coming to a place of acceptance within yourself of your situation, both chronic illness situation and living with this pandemic. And by the way, if you want to hear about coping with the pandemic in general, basically coping with sheltering in place, I did a talk a few weeks ago that you could probably scroll down on Lupus LA to find, and that goes into a lot of detail about coping with the stress and anxiety of the pandemic. So let's start by just reviewing some of the public health risks. And one of the things I noticed in looking over the Lupus LA talks from the doctors is that having an autoimmune condition doesn't automatically mean that you're high risk. And it's really important to talk to your doctor about your specific condition and, whether or not you are at risk for complications or more at risk for contracting COVID-19, because just because you are autoimmune, have an autoimmune issue doesn't necessarily mean that you're higher risk. Okay, so let's look at some of the environments where, and just talk about what the risk factors are. If you're in a room with poor air exchange with a lot of people, the risk is always going to elevate. And if you're inside with people talking, it's a certain risk. And if they're talking loudly and they're yelling, or if they're singing, it increases the risk because more comes out of people's mouths, more droplets are expelled into the environment, which increases the opportunity to inhale them. And I'm sure that you heard about the choir members who were infected in Washington. That was a huge case, and there was a big study, I believe. I can't remember the exact numbers of people that were infected, but it was a pretty large number of people. So singing is a situation where the droplets are aerosolized and travel around the room. I think they were in a room the size of a volleyball court, if I'm not mistaken. So basically the idea is the larger number of people in a room is going to, who are talking and talking loudly and even shouting, is going to increase the risk of contracting the virus. I am following a biologist named Erin Bromage. It's E-R-I-N, and the last name is Bromage with 2 M's. ErinBromage.com. So a lot of the information, he is looking at all the scientific data and putting it together and sort of curating it. And some of the information I'll be talking about today comes from his website. So here's the idea. It's time plus exposure that becomes important in an indoor environment. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. Where are people getting infected? Well, a lot of people are getting infected at home because a household member contracts it in the community and then they bring it home. And of course, there's a lot of sustained contact with household members on objects and materials that are being touched that carry infection, so such as clothes and utensils and furniture, right? High contact. And so if a family member contracts COVID-19, it's really important to take extreme care with laundry and disinfecting surfaces and not sharing spaces to the extent that that's possible, and cleaning surfaces. But let's move on to other types of environments. When you're out in public, first off, if you can avoid using public bathrooms, that's probably a wise move because, again, there are a lot of high-touch surfaces with door handles, faucets, and stall doors. And when you flush the toilet, the droplets can be aerosolized. So if you have to use a public bathroom, you know, wash your hands, use a napkin to touch things, and really treat the bathroom with extreme caution and close the lid of the toilet. Okay, just really basic stuff. And I don't know how many of you already know these things, so I hope this isn't redundant for you. By the way, when I'm talking today, I'm going to kind of probably intersperse the words, you know, aerosolized particles and droplets, and there's still a lot of controversy in the scientific community about these concepts, but the basic idea is the droplets are what fall to the surfaces and can contaminate you after you touch something and then touch your mouth or your nose or your eyes, whereas the aerosolized particles are what remain in the air and sort of float around. So that's just the simple explanation of it. Okay, so we talked about bathrooms. Let's talk in general about interiors. A breath is going to release a certain amount of droplets, whereas a cough is going to release more, and a sneeze is going to release even more. And the coughs and sneezes, they're going to travel at a higher velocity, right? So they're apparently, a sneeze can travel at 200 miles per hour, just to give you an idea. So if you're in a small room and somebody who's infected sneezes, it's, you know, you're going to be at a higher risk. And without going into sort of viral replication and all this scientific stuff, I think it's just important to know that exposure to the virus times time, meaning the duration of time that you're in the room, is what essentially is going to increase the risk of getting infected. And that's actually the formula for contact tracing, which is something that we unfortunately haven't been doing enough of. Okay, so the bottom line is, if somebody is sick with coronavirus and they're an asymptomatic spreader, and I'll talk about that momentarily, anyone that you're spending greater than 10 minutes with in a face-to-face situation, asymptomatic or symptomatic, pardon me, let's say without masks in an enclosed space, is going to put you at risk for infection. And really, again, I'm trying to call attention to the fact that you may be going into environment sort of not knowing what the risks are, and I just want you to be armed with the knowledge. Now, we know that 44% of all infections are spread by people who are asymptomatic. And this is why masking is so crucial, and what I think this is why a lot of the anti-maskers, I'm just assuming that they don't quite understand these concepts, because if they did, they would be wearing a mask to protect other people, you know, friends and family, and co-workers. So if we look at some of the studies, although the ship outbreaks were very big in the media, they're not at the top of the list of the largest outbreaks. The largest outbreaks have been in nursing homes, in prisons, at religious ceremonies, and in workplaces, especially workplaces that are, you know, have a high density of people, such as the meatpacking facilities, have a cold environment, and also in workplaces that have open floor plans like call centers and other kinds of offices that don't have private offices and also don't have good ventilation, okay? So let's see. So weddings, funerals, birthdays, those were the early spreading events, and the face-to-face business networking conferences. You probably heard about the Biogen conference. And then there have been a lot of epidemiological studies, one in particular that got a lot of press about the guy who sat at a table with 9 friends, and within an hour and a half, 50% of the people at his table were infected and 75% at an adjacent table, et cetera, et cetera. And then those people went on to go to different events and continue to spread and spread, and that's kind of how it works. I'm kind of rushing through this because I really want to get to the coping stuff, but the point is that interior environments where there are lots of people and there isn't good ventilation is going to be a higher risk environment. The call center case, which was, can't remember. There was a call center case where 92 out of the 94 people on one side of the office got infected, and I can't remember where that was, but and the choir, of course, was a huge case, which really helped scientists learn a lot about talking, yelling, breath, and singing. By the way, in the meatpacking examples, the workers were having to yell over very loud machinery. So that was one of the issues. And then indoor sporting events, there have been several studies with the attendees and the athletes getting sick due to the up-close, heavy breathing, personal contact. Okay, so you get the picture. All right, let's see. Let me skip over some of this really technical stuff. So shopping, I get a question a lot about the shopping, and I looked this up, and Aaron Bermage talked about the fact that really there are only a small percentage of traced infections from shopping because remember, it's volume of the space and the density of the people. And the time inside the store. So if you're in a big store and you're sort of beelining, let's say, to the pharmacy, and you're wearing your mask and there are just a few people in the space, it's a relatively low risk, according to Dr. Bramage. Now, if you're standing, let's talk about outdoor for the moment. When you're outdoors and you're standing or sitting 6 feet apart, there's really enough time, there isn't enough time, sorry, to achieve the viral load, particularly with masks. And there's wind and infinite outdoor space for viral dilution, which reduces viral load. So plus you have the effect of sunlight and heat and humidity, which serve to reduce the viral survival, right, and minimize your risk outdoors. So if I'm outside, you know, if some jogger goes by or a bike rider, according to Dr. Bramage, even if they're not wearing a mask, they're probably not around you long enough because dose and time is really important. And, you know, wind factors and heat and aerosolizing can blow it away. So that's a good thing. So outdoor environments are, you know, pretty safe. If you do end up choosing to socialize, you're just going to have to be careful not to share food and beverages and utensils, and, you know, keep your hands clean by washing. And that's when you really use the social distancing and wear the mask. etc. I mean, of course, you're going to do that in an indoor environment too, but that's what social distancing was really designed for. It just doesn't hold as well in an indoor space if you have all those other high risk factors like too many people and poor ventilation, right, in a small space. Okay, so when you, bottom line is that it's safer outdoors, and when you look at how to move through this transition of society opening up, aside from all the basic stuff like wearing a mask and sticking to the outdoors and using good hygiene and all of that stuff that you may need to ask yourself some really hard questions. First off, I would suggest have a heart-to-heart with your doctor about your specific risk situation. Are you at greater risk for complications or for getting infected? And then look at what your risk environment is at work if you're planning to go back. Is there a high volume of people? Are you in a cubicle? Are you in an open floor plan? Are you talking to people all day? Is there plenty of space with a low density of people? Or are you up close and personal? Do you have the ability to work remotely? I have heard that 37% to 40% of people have successfully been working remotely. And if you are in a professional career or the sciences or something technical, business management, finance, things like that, it might be important to really consider advocating for yourself, if you haven't already, to continue working remotely, because you are entitled to accommodations. And I'm going to talk a little later about sort of the fear of standing up for yourself and sort of overcoming that and really asserting yourself in this situation to protect yourself. If you're in a job that does require, operating a vehicle or some mechanical devices, or it's an essential work position like a healthcare worker or a grocery store worker, or you work in a pharmacy or you work in a lab, or it probably can't be done remotely, and then you may have to consider other options like redesigning your work or finding another position or figuring out some creative solution to your situation, or even potentially taking time off on a leave and utilizing things like FMLA or disability, which, by the way, there was an attorney who spoke last week. Her name is Ramit Mizrahi, and she was fantastic and got into all the details on those options. So I suggest listening to her. So let's talk about coping. How you cope is very much going to be a function of how you were already coping with your autoimmune condition or other pre-existing health condition. Whether you had come to terms with your lupus even before the pandemic, had you educated your friends and family and your employer, not necessarily revealed your lupus, but, let them know that you have some sort of a disability. Had you garnered accommodations? Had you already worked through all the emotional phases of having a chronic illness, such as anger and sadness, and sort of gotten out of the denial phase and done the emotional work of coming to terms with lupus? Because that is going to help you now if you've already done that work. It means that you've probably adapted to a life of uncertainty and you've been through all the emotional stages. You've grieved your old healthy self and you've come to terms with having an illness and navigating the medical system and setting boundaries in your relationships and creating healthy relationships with your doctors, learning how to communicate, all that stuff. Perhaps you've even already advocated for accommodations at work. If you've done this work of adapting to your illness, you have probably learned to balance work and home life, and you've become someone who's pretty good at self-care. And probably set some boundaries and learn to assert yourself a bit. But again, if you haven't done this work of moving through these emotional phases, this is going to be the time to do it. This is going to be the time to work through denial and begin to deal with the uncertainties and learn to set boundaries. It doesn't necessarily mean disclosing your specific condition. Again, that is not required in any situation with friends or with employers, but letting people know that you're high risk. And the reason is that if you haven't come to terms with it, it's going to be hard for you to feel good about advocating for yourself. If you've been in denial and you haven't quite accepted your chronic illness situation, you know, you may be somebody who is doing too much and then collapsing into a flare. However, flares can happen for all kinds of other reasons, of course, right? They can be triggered by all kinds of environmental reasons and stress, and other medical reasons. But the point is, if you haven't accepted your condition, there's a tendency to withdraw into isolation, and there's a tendency to hesitate to advocate for yourself. So when you're in that state, opening up about your health or opening up about being high risk may be harder, but you can do it. And the first step in doing it is really accepting that you are making a healthy choice to protect yourself if you're high risk, and really getting to a place where you feel good about that choice and solid about that choice. Because there are people out there who may want to make you feel that you're highly neurotic about how careful you're being, or who may peer pressure you, or employers who may pressure you, or friends who may pressure you to go out, you know, and they're not wearing a mask and you feel uncomfortable saying, hey, would you mind putting your mask on? You know. So let's talk a little bit about acceptance and getting to that place of acceptance. Not just acceptance of the lupus, which of course is very important, or an autoimmune condition, but also acceptance of the pandemic, that this is a reality that we're all in for a while, you know, and how do we really go about accepting this without becoming overly depressed or overly anxious? And for those of you, I'm going to focus on one specific thing that you can do that I think is one of the most important things, which is connecting with other people, connecting with other people who are high risk. They don't necessarily have to be autoimmune patients, but they could just be people who are high risk, who are going through similar things. For those of you who are already really social and already really connected and active in a lot of groups, then you're probably doing pretty well at accepting what you need to do now to stand up for yourself. But for those of you who are prone to isolation, or a little less social, or you live alone, or perhaps you live with people who you're not as close to, who don't understand your situation, it is more challenging. And being isolated and focused on disability or focused on pain can really lead to a worsening of depression. It's important to know that you're not the only one out there, and to really seek out resources and groups where you can connect to other people. So that might be Lupus LA, like what you're doing today, just listening to a recording, or you know, connecting live. That's really the first step, because there are plenty of people out there to commiserate with, you know, to talk to and to relate to, and who are going through the same thing. And it's just a very grounding experience, and helps you come to terms with the reality of what you're going through and not feel so badly about it. Once you connect and you feel compassion for other people who are going through the same thing, you begin to feel compassion for yourself and accept your own situation. That's how it works. There are a lot of people who are saying to me, I'm just not a groupie, you know, I'm just not that kind of person. I don't like to hear people whine, you know, and it isn't about whining. It isn't about self-pity. It's about sharing. It's about connecting. It's about learning tools. It's about tips and tricks, and learning from other people, and having a positive emotional and spiritual experience with other people through identification. So even if you're not a groupie, I just really can't recommend that enough. And there are a lot of organizations out there. It might be an autoimmune group, fibromyalgia, or scleroderma, or arthritis, or lupus, or it could be a 12-step program, or it could be some other pain forum. It could be anything that you're dealing with that you connect with. And of course, you have to kind of like put aside personality sometimes and just garner, the good stuff. So once you do come to acceptance, then it boils down to getting to a place where you can assert yourself in social situations with friends by setting boundaries and sticking up for yourself, and then advocating for yourself in professional situations. And really, the skill set is the same. And the term I like to use for it is diplomatic assertiveness, because a lot of people think that speaking up for yourself involves confrontation or conflict. And it's really not the case. When you feel good about taking care of yourself, there's really nothing controversial about it. It might mean not participating in an indoor social gathering. It might just mean saying, hey, I'm not doing that yet, but I'd love to get together with you on Zoom or house party. Let's plan something for another night, and then organizing something that'll work for you. It may mean asking for accommodations at work, meaning continuing to work remotely, or asking for a private office with windows, or asking to work on a shift where there are fewer people. It might mean discussing, if you can't work it out, it may mean discussing, utilizing your benefits under FMLA, which the attorney pointed out. We have CIFRA here, which sort of is an umbrella that covers that. So obviously I can't give you today the exact words and how to use diplomatic assertiveness. It's kind of a technique where you point out positives first, about how well it's going, let's say with your remote working, and how much you're getting accomplished, and how focused you are, and how dedicated you are to the company, and then sort of asking for your needs and explaining your high risk situation. But there are very specific techniques that we use. But the reality is that, there are a lot of bosses and employers who are also high risk, who are going to be concerned about their own situations and have family members that they're concerned about. So this is a really great time to garner support for yourself and to make some of these moves that you might have been afraid to make before in terms of advocating for yourself at work. So let's see. And really, until there is a vaccination or treatment, it's going to be important to be really strong and really articulate and clear about your high risk situation if you think you are high risk. So I want to emphasize that believing in your choice and feeling good about it is the first step. It's really interesting that we take pride in working out and eating healthy and general self-care. We're supposed to be proud of that, but somehow we're not supposed to be proud about this idea of protecting ourselves from the virus. Somehow it makes us like a scaredy cat, or we're not being compliant with our bosses. And I think we just have to really completely shift that and say, because I have self-confidence and because I have high self-esteem and care about my life and my family and, my friends and loved ones, I'm making this decision to do the healthy thing. So let's see. And obviously when it comes to work, you may or may not get what you need, even after, asserting yourself diplomatically and really having some positive interactions. But there are legal steps that you can take if you're not getting your needs met, and there are people to reach out to, including attorneys, who can help you to navigate and help give you advice as to how to approach those situations where you may be running into barriers. But really the idea is to avoid doing anything that you're personally not comfortable with. And, I have clients that have gone into families' homes where, let's say I had a client that went into a brother's home and the brother wasn't wearing a mask and the kids weren't wearing a mask and she was wearing her mask, and she went in and washed her hands immediately and had her mask on, and they said, the brother said, "Oh, you're doing all that stuff?" And so she had to sort of decline the visit and say, "Hey, let's FaceTime instead, because you know, I'm protecting myself and I'm uncomfortable, you know, with the kids running around and getting too close without the mask. It's a sad situation that there are these situations arising. I had another client go out last week with a friend to an outside dining space, and while they were walking there, the friend refused to put on a mask and wasn't moving out of the way for other people who were getting close. And so she decided that she's not going to be doing that again. It's just uncomfortable for her. But she was able to talk about it with her friend. So either the friend will modify the behavior or she won't, you know, do that again. But the point I'd like to make today is that you're really not alone. And the real advantage of doing this now is that there are so many other people out there with hidden disabilities and illnesses, and even employers who are in the same situation. And as I said before, with 45% of people having some kind of chronic illness and 25% being over 60, we all have to sort of band together and ask for what we need and reach out, you know, to get to the support to figure out ways to do that, and to support each other during this kind of long, difficult phase of life that we were not planning on or expecting. So self-acceptance and acceptance of the situation is really, really crucial, and working through all of those emotional phases of accepting having a chronic illness is sort of the first step, and then coming to terms with the pandemic. And if any of you feel like you want to talk more about, you know, any of these emotional phases and how to move through them, and how to find groups that can support you, or how to find resources, you know, legal resources, please reach out to me or reach out to Lupus LA so that we can help you with this process, because we're all in it together. And I think it's going to be a little longer than we all expected. So I think I'm going to wrap up now. I don't know if Brianna is going to propose that we do questions, or.
Yeah. Hey, Lisa. Thank you so much for your time.
You're so welcome.
We really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with our lupus community today. And just really quickly before we sign off, I just want to shout out to everyone listening today from our team. If you have any follow-up questions around this topic for us or for Lisa, or if you simply need assistance navigating this really stressful time, please reach out to our team. We're here to help you. You're not alone. Just shoot us an email at info@lupusla.org. or send us a direct message on social media. We're here to support you. Thank you so much for your time, Lisa.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. All right.